Europe was drowning in darkness. Until Africa sent light, the Moors brought math, medicine, architecture, and hygiene. And Europe called it the Renaissance, but they never told you who taught them. They lied to you. Your teachers lied to you. Don't get mad at me for exposing the truth. Just give me 30 seconds to explain. When Rome fell, Europe fell with it. The cities that once glimmered with marble turned into graveyards of ignorance. Streets ran with waste. Rivers turned to disease, and the average man feared the stars more than he feared sin. Kings ruled over mud and misery. Priests whispered superstition instead of science, and the continent's fire of knowledge burned down to embers. Europe was sinking into its own shadow, but across the Mediterranean, Africa was alive, golden, thriving, and overflowing with wisdom. In the deserts of the Maghreb and the courts of Mali, scholars recited mathematics as poetry. Doctors studied anatomy centuries ahead of their time. Architects carved beauty into stone with precision that could rival heaven's geometry. These were the Moors, Africans of deep learning and vision. And when they crossed into Spain in 711 AD, they didn't come to conquer, they came to enlighten. The Moors built cities that glowed in the night, while Europe still stumbled in darkness. They paved streets, built aqueducts, introduced public baths, and made hygiene a culture. They opened libraries with thousands of books, while European nobles could barely read their own names. Cordoba became the crown jewel of civilization, a city so radiant that travelers described its glow as if the sun had refused to set. Here, African scholars taught Europeans how to think again. Algebra, chemistry, astronomy, subjects Europe would later claim as its own, were first mastered under Moorish roofs. The word algebra itself comes from algebra, a gift from these African minds. The compass, the astrolabe, the surgical scalpel, all instruments of progress, all passed through African hands before Europe could even imagine their use. The Moors didn't just save Europe from darkness, they rebuilt it from the ashes of its ignorance. But instead of gratitude, history gave them silence. Instead of statues, it gave them erasure. Because to admit that Africa was the mother of Europe's rebirth would mean rewriting every chapter of the Western story. It would mean that the Renaissance wasn't born in Florence or Paris. It was imported, carried like sacred fire from the libraries of Africa. Picture the contrast. Europe's nobles drenched in perfume to mask their filth, while in Moorish Spain, baths were temples of purity. European medicine relied on prayer, while African doctors dissected bodies to understand the laws of life. The Moors taught Europe to wash, to read, to calculate, to cure, and in return, they were painted as foreigners. But they were never foreigners to civilization. They were civilization. They traced their lineage to empires that had mastered architecture, while Europe still built huts. When they built the Alhambra, they encoded mathematics into art, walls that spoke in number and symmetry, geometry, so precise it still confounds engineers today. Every tile, every arch, every dome whispered of divine order. Yet the textbooks call it Arabic design, as if Africa didn't shape it. The truth is, the Moors were not just part of history, they were history's turning point. Without them, there would be no Renaissance. Without them, no Da Vinci, no Galileo, no Europe as we know it. They reintroduced civilization to a continent that had forgotten how to be civilized. And when Europe finally rose again, it carried the torch lit by African hands. But they didn't thank the flame. They covered it, renamed it, and called it their own. That's the real theft. Not of gold, not of land, but of legacy. So when they tell you that Africa was primitive and Europe was enlightened, remember, Europe was the student, Africa the teacher. The Moors didn't just save Europe, they rebuilt it, one idea, one equation, one bath at a time. After the Moors crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and claimed Al-Andalus, they didn't just bring armies, they brought an entire civilization in motion. Imagine this. While much of Europe still burned witches for predicting weather, Moorish astronomers charted the stars with instruments of brass and intellect. In Cordoba alone, streetlights lined paved roads centuries before London or Paris had even dreamed of such order. There were 70 libraries, thousands of manuscripts, scholars from Africa, Arabia, and even Europe itself, coming to learn from black intellectuals who spoke the language of science like poetry. At the heart of this movement were African dynasties, rulers descended from Berber and sub-Saharan lineages, dark-skinned kings and queens, who saw no difference between faith and reason. Under their rule, Spain became the beacon of the medieval world. Granada, Seville, Toledo, each city became a university in its own right. The Moors didn't only introduce ideas, they built institutions to sustain them. Universities like Al-Qarawiyyin, founded by a woman of African descent, Fatima al-Fihri, in Morocco, became the mother of all modern universities. From there, the flame of learning spread into Europe through the students who came to study beneath Moorish masters. Mathematics evolved from the simple Roman numerals that shackled European thought to the fluid Arabic numerals that allowed infinite calculation. Architecture evolved from crude fortresses to structures that breathed, mosques and palaces that fused geometry, poetry, and engineering into living art. Even agriculture was transformed. Irrigation systems, citrus fruit, rice, sugarcane, all introduced by African hands to revive European soil. They turned barren lands into gardens, taught people how to manage water, and built mills that could harness wind and river power. Every system Europe would later claim as progress had African roots beneath its foundation. But while the cities flourished, the people too changed. Europeans who had known filth and famine began to see the benefits of hygiene, learning, and order. The Moors introduced soap, public baths, clean water, concepts so foreign to medieval Europe that they were initially mocked. Yet over time, they became standard practice. This was more than a cultural exchange, it was a resurrection. Europe was being re-educated, re-engineered, reborn. And what's more, these Africans ruled with remarkable tolerance. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side, working, trading, studying. In Moorish Spain, a man's worth was measured by his mind, not his birth. It was one of the rare moments in history where color, creed, and class momentarily gave way to intellect. While the rest of Europe silenced knowledge under the Church, Al-Andalus encouraged questioning. You could find Jewish scholars translating Arabic texts into Latin, preserving the wisdom that would one day ignite the Renaissance. The bridges built in those classrooms and libraries became the arteries through which European civilization was revived. Yet this period, known as the Golden Age of Al-Andalus, would later be buried beneath centuries of distortion. Artists in later Europe would paint the Moors lighter, whiter, stripping them of their African features to fit a safer narrative. Maps would erase black scholars' names, replacing them with Latinized versions. The libraries, that once stood as monuments to African intellect, were burned, their books destroyed, their wisdom rewritten. What was once the pride of Africa became Europe's greatest secret, but the evidence remains, written in architecture, preserved in manuscripts, and etched in the DNA of the people who still carry traces of those African rulers. The Moors were not guests in Europe's story, they were the authors of its rebirth. They saved Europe, not through war, but through wisdom, not through conquest, but through creation. Every time a European learned to read, to calculate, to bathe, to heal, they were touching the legacy of Africa. But history doesn't like to give credit where it belongs. They couldn't admit that the hands which rebuilt Europe were dark, that the minds behind its revival were African, because that truth would rewrite everything they built afterward. It would expose that the Renaissance was never an awakening, it was an inheritance. The knowledge Europe claimed as its own had been freely given by those they would later call inferior. And that is the irony at the heart of history. The very people who saved civilization were the ones it chose to erase. But their legacy still glows, like the lanterns that once lit the streets of Cordoba, proof that even when history tries to bury the truth, it cannot kill the light. When we speak of the Moors, we are not speaking of myth. We are speaking of real people, real dynasties, and real empires that stretched from the deserts of Africa to the palaces of Spain. The story didn't begin in Europe. It began in the heart of Africa, where ancient civilizations like Mali, Ghana, and Songhai had already perfected the arts of governance, science, and trade, long before the first European kingdom had learned to write its own history. The Moors who crossed into Spain carried the genius of those lands with them: mathematicians from Timbuktu, architects from Morocco, physicians trained in the libraries of Fez. They came not as invaders, but as restorers, bringing back order to a continent that had collapsed under its own ignorance. When they entered Iberia in 711 CE, Europe was fragmented, broken by tribal feuds and religious superstition. Roads were unpaved, cities unlit, literacy almost extinct. But within decades of Moorish rule, cities like Cordoba and Seville glowed with the light of thousands of oil lamps. Scholars from as far as Germany and England traveled to study under African teachers. What they found there changed the course of Western thought forever. The Moors translated the works of ancient Greeks, like Aristotle and Plato, then improved upon them. They introduced algebra, a discipline born from African and Arab scholars working side by side. They taught surgical techniques so advanced that European doctors would not match them for centuries. Moorish hospitals offered free medical treatment, separating wards for different illnesses, while in Europe, disease was still seen as divine punishment. The precision of their architecture reflected their precision of thought: horseshoe arches, domes that caught sunlight like mirrors of heaven, geometric tiles that symbolized the infinite nature of creation. The Alhambra in Granada was not merely a palace, it was a philosophy carved in stone, a living testament to African intellect. Yet while their science transformed Europe, their spirituality softened it. The Moors practiced a faith that valued intellect as a form of worship. To study was to praise, to seek knowledge was to serve God. This mindset infected Europe with curiosity after centuries of fear. Soon Europeans began to look up to the stars, to philosophy, to invention, and that awakening would later be rebranded as the Renaissance. But what textbooks fail to mention is that the Renaissance didn't start in Florence, it started in Moorish Spain. Leonardo da Vinci's genius was not born in isolation. It was the fruit of a world the Moors had already cultivated. The instruments he used, the mathematics he applied, the medical insights he admired, all had roots in African and Moorish science. Even the Gothic cathedrals of Europe borrowed their pointed arches from Moorish design. What they called Christian architecture had Muslim African fingerprints all over it. But the rise of the Moors also reshaped Europe's identity in another way, through exposure to refinement. Before their arrival, European nobility lived without plumbing, slept on straw, and bathed only a few times a year. The Moors introduced soap made of olive oil and lye, scented oils, and public baths with marble floors. They changed the way people ate, introducing utensils, spices, rice, sugar, and citrus fruits. They taught textile production, silk weaving, and the use of cotton. In short, they civilized a continent that had forgotten what civilization meant. But progress often threatens power. The Church viewed this new African-led enlightenment as dangerous, a challenge to its spiritual monopoly. So while they borrowed Moorish wisdom, they also began rewriting the narrative. Over centuries, European chroniclers painted the Moors as foreign intruders, their African origins blurred or denied. In paintings, they lightened their skin, flattened their features, turned kings into caricatures, and scientists into nameless Arabs. Yet the truth survived in traces, in manuscripts, in artifacts, in the very foundations of European cities. You can still see their mark today in Spanish words, architecture, and culture. Words like algebra, alchemy, almond and orange all come from the Moors. Even the Spanish guitar evolved from African and Moorish instruments. Their fingerprints are everywhere, hidden in plain sight. But perhaps their greatest legacy wasn't what they built, but what they believed, that knowledge belonged to everyone. In their universities, the poor could study alongside the rich, and women could pursue education, an idea revolutionary for its time. The Moors proved that enlightenment wasn't reserved for the few, it was the birthright of all humanity, and that belief would echo through the ages, carried quietly through the centuries, by those who refused to let their light go out. Europe may have rewritten their story, but history still whispers the truth, that the people who pulled Europe from the dark were Africans, and the light they carried still burns wherever truth is remembered. Europe didn't just wake up one morning and discover light, it was taught, guided, and transformed by people who had already mastered it. The Moors didn't only bring science, they brought a philosophy of balance, a way of living that fused intellect with spirit. They believed that a person could not be wise unless they were clean, that the health of the body reflected the health of the soul. That's why in every major Moorish city, from Granada to Toledo, there were public baths, gardens, fountains, and libraries. Water wasn't just a necessity, it was sacred, a reflection of divine order. Imagine the contrast. While Moorish scholars in Cordoba debated astronomy and medicine in candlelit courtyards, most of Europe's kings were still illiterate, signing decrees with crosses because they couldn't write their own names. In the 10th century, Cordoba alone had nearly 500,000 residents, 70 libraries, and 300 public baths. Paris at that same time was a muddy village with fewer than 50,000 people. The Moors didn't just build cities, they built systems that allowed brilliance to thrive. Education wasn't limited to clergy, it was for anyone with curiosity. Farmers could attend lectures on irrigation, merchants could learn accounting, and even women had access to scholarly study, something unheard of in Christian Europe. The African influence was everywhere, from the geometric mosaics, inspired by sub-Saharan art, to the advanced irrigation channels, derived from Saharan engineering. Their empire wasn't sustained by conquest alone, but by administration, intellect, and innovation. The Caliphate of Cordoba became one of the most advanced societies on earth, where poetry and mathematics existed side by side, and where debate was a sport of kings. They produced thinkers like Averroes, who reintroduced Aristotle to Europe, and Al-Zarawi, whose medical encyclopedia became Europe's guidebook for 500 years. These were not borrowed ideas, they were refined and expanded through African scholarship. The Moors even developed advanced optics, understanding how the eye perceives light and color centuries before Newton. But here's the irony. While the Moors celebrated learning as divine, much of Europe saw it as heresy. When Europeans finally began translating the works of these African scholars, they removed the names of their authors, rebranding their discoveries as European inventions. Algebra became mathematics, surgery became modern medicine, and astronomy became Renaissance science. They took the fruit and destroyed the roots. But history always leaves fingerprints. The manuscripts of the Moors are still stored in the Escorial and in libraries across North Africa. Tens of thousands of volumes that testify to a world built by African intellect. Even the architecture speaks. The Alhambra's inscriptions whisper praises to knowledge and beauty. Its walls are carved not with idols, but with geometry, proof that the builders saw divine truth in precision itself. Step inside and you feel harmony, balance, proportion, the very elements that would later define Europe's rebirth. But Europe didn't invent rebirth, it received it. The seeds of the Renaissance were planted in African soil, watered by Moorish scholars, and only later harvested by Europe. Consider art. Before Moorish influence, European paintings were flat, stiff, and lifeless. It was Moorish study of perspective and mathematics that allowed artists like Brunelleschi and Leonardo to bring depth into their canvases. The concept of vanishing point, which defines Western painting, is rooted in geometry. The Moors had already mastered even their concept of beauty. The symmetry of face and body was influenced by African ideals of proportion and balance. Yet none of this fit the story Europe wanted to tell. When the Reconquista began, and Christian armies pushed the Moors out of Spain, they didn't just destroy a people, they erased their memory. Mosques became cathedrals, libraries were burned, Arabic names were Latinized, and Africa's role in Europe's enlightenment was rewritten into silence. Still, their influence couldn't be fully killed. Every stone bridge, every aqueduct, every orchard in southern Spain still carries traces of Moorish design. The orange groves of Seville, the palaces of Granada, the very language of Spain itself, all of it hums with African memory. And though the Church may have rebranded their light as divine revelation, those who study the truth can still trace the beam back to its source. The Moors didn't just change Europe, they redefined what civilization meant. They showed that power could coexist with wisdom, that faith and reason could walk together. They built a society so advanced that when Europe finally caught up centuries later, it called that progress modernity. But modernity was simply Africa remembered. They may have been erased from the paintings and textbooks, but their fingerprints still shimmer in the stones, their legacy buried beneath layers of denial. The Renaissance may have worn a European face, but its soul was carved by African hands. When the Moors first stepped onto Iberian soil in 711 CE, Europe was crumbling under the weight of its own ignorance. The Western Roman Empire had fallen centuries before, leaving behind chaos, disease, and decay. Roads that once connected empires were overgrown and abandoned. Libraries, repositories of human knowledge, had been burned or forgotten. Most of the population couldn't read. Not even the priests. Hygiene was non-existent. People believed bathing invited demons. Into that world came African light, an army of thinkers, architects, engineers, and doctors, led by Tariq Ibn Ziyad, the Berber general, whose name still echoes in Gibraltar, Jabal al-Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. He was not just a conqueror, he was a messenger of civilization. Behind his warriors came scholars, astronomers, and builders who carried not swords alone, but manuscripts filled with the knowledge of Kemet, Nubia, and Timbuktu. They brought irrigation systems that turned barren land into gardens, algebra that organized economies, and medicine that saved lives. They didn't come to destroy Europe, they came to rebuild it. In less than a century, the Moors transformed Spain into one of the most advanced societies on earth. Cordoba's streets were paved and lit with oil lamps, while London was still a swamp of mud huts. The Moors introduced hospitals with wards, universities with admission standards, and libraries that housed hundreds of thousands of books, at a time when the largest Christian library in Europe had fewer than 1,000. This was Africa's gift to Europe: order from chaos, reason from superstition. But the story was never told that way. Later historians would frame the Moorish era as an occupation, a word that erases the enlightenment it brought. Yet even their enemies couldn't deny the evidence. Medieval Christian monks wrote with awe about the cities of Al-Andalus, describing fountains, markets, and gardens so grand they seemed mythical. The Europeans called the Moors dark men, not just for their skin, but for the shadow they cast over Europe's supposed superiority. And what a shadow it was, stretching across architecture, science, philosophy, and language. Every time a European used a word like alcohol, algebra, or algorithm, they spoke the memory of the Moors, often without realizing it. That's how deep the influence ran. These were not invaders, they were educators. They didn't just conquer land, they conquered ignorance. In places like Seville and Toledo, scholars of all faiths worked together, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, translating and preserving ancient texts. That cross-pollination of knowledge would become the seed of the European Renaissance centuries later. But here's what textbooks refused to say: that Renaissance wasn't European at all. It was African rebirth, wearing a European disguise. When the Moors brought light to Europe, they did it not through oppression, but through elevation. They built universities that accepted anyone with intellect, regardless of race or background. They trained surgeons who understood anatomy centuries before the church permitted dissections. They charted the stars so precisely that their astronomical tables guided Columbus across the Atlantic long after their empire had fallen. Even the modern compass and astrolabe owe their refinement to Moorish science. Yet as Europe grew stronger under their influence, resentment grew alongside it. The same people who learned from African masters began to rewrite history, stripping the color from its source. They would later call the Moors Arabs, Saracens, or Muslims, carefully avoiding the word African to separate Europe's rise from Africa's hand. But the record speaks plainly. The first waves of Moors were Berbers and black Africans from North and West Africa, descendants of ancient Nubia and Mali, people of deep melanin and even deeper wisdom. They were the bridge between Africa's ancient past and Europe's awakening. And yet, centuries later, the world would pretend that bridge never existed. Ask yourself, if Europe truly rose from its own genius, why does every step of its rebirth lead back to Moorish Spain? Why do its greatest thinkers, from Aquinas to Copernicus, trace their lineage of learning back to translations made by African scholars? Because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of shining through. Europe's age of reason was built on African foundations. They can rename the builders, but they cannot erase the architecture of truth. By the time the Moors had established their stronghold in Al-Andalus, Europe was forced to look southward in awe. What had once been dismissed as a land of dark men had become the beacon of intellect, elegance, and urban sophistication. The cities of Cordoba, Seville, and Granada glittered like jewels, clean streets, running water, and public lamps illuminating the night, while most of Europe remained wrapped in filth and shadow. But the real transformation went deeper than stone and mortar. It was in the mindset, in the elevation of thought. The Moors taught that knowledge was divine, that studying the world was a form of worship. This belief came directly from Africa's ancient intellectual traditions, echoes of Kemet and Kush, where priests were scientists, and where philosophy and astronomy were one and the same. Under Moorish rule, Europe rediscovered the art of thinking. African engineers taught irrigation systems that revolutionized agriculture, introducing new crops like sugarcane, citrus, and cotton. They built aqueducts and mills that sustained entire populations. Moorish doctors pioneered surgical instruments still recognizable today, while their pharmacologists cataloged over 1,000 medicinal herbs. African astronomers calculated planetary motion with precision that stunned later European scientists. Every layer of society, from architecture to language to fashion, carried an African fingerprint. Even the European concept of chivalry, the idea of disciplined honor among knights, was borrowed from Moorish codes of conduct, refined from African warrior ethics that valued courage, intellect, and restraint over brute force. But let's make this plain. These were not slaves or servants, bringing scraps of wisdom. They were teachers, engineers, nobles, and philosophers. They came from kingdoms that had libraries before Europe had literacy, from cultures that had built cities before Europe had roads. The Berber dynasties, the Malians, and the scholars of Timbuktu all shared bloodlines with the Moors who brought the Renaissance to Europe. This wasn't foreign invasion, it was a transfer of light. Yet as centuries passed, that light was deliberately dimmed. Western historians painted the Moors as outsiders, omitting their African identity in favor of a sanitized Arab narrative. They wrote textbooks that showed pale philosophers and erased the dark faces that once ruled European cities. They praised the Renaissance without ever mentioning who sparked it. Even the architectural marvels, like the Alhambra, were described as mysteries, as though they appeared out of nowhere, rather than being the culmination of African geometry and design philosophy. But truth doesn't fade. It waits. Every stone in Granada whispers the names of the African builders who shaped it. The horseshoe arch, the mosaic pattern, the intricate tile work, all of them trace back to African design principles. found in ancient Nubia and Carthage. Even Europe's musical evolution owes thanks to Moorish influence. African rhythms, brought through Andalusian instruments and scales, would eventually birth flamenco, a sound Europe would later claim as its own. In every corner of life, the Moors reshaped Europe's destiny, and yet history books treat them as a footnote. That's not oversight, that's erasure, because acknowledging the African root means rewriting Europe's entire self-image. It means admitting that their rebirth came from black hands. Think about that. Centuries of European power built on African foundations, then covered with marble lies. But marble cracks, and through those cracks, the truth shines. The Moors not only taught Europe how to read again, they taught it how to live again. Hygiene, education, architecture, mathematics, these weren't gifts, they were reminders of what civilization really looks like when the dark skin of Africa carries the torch. Yet, instead of gratitude, Europe chose denial. Ask yourself why. Why celebrate Da Vinci and hide Ibn Rushd? Why glorify Michelangelo and forget the architects who shaped the Alhambra? Because pride cannot coexist with truth when truth destroys illusion. But the time for illusion is over. The time to reclaim the story is now. The world has called the Moors mysterious for too long. There's nothing mysterious about brilliance, it just looked too African for them to accept. The irony of the so-called Dark Ages is that the only darkness came from Europe itself. The light was blazing across North Africa and Al-Andalus, where the Moors had turned knowledge into a lifestyle. Walk through the streets of 10th century Cordoba, and you'd see what real civilization looked like. Clean streets paved with stone, oil lamps glowing from every corner, public fountains fed by aqueducts that brought fresh water from the mountains, children running to schools where they learned mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy side by side. Now imagine London or Paris at that same moment. Mud, plague, superstition. People feared washing because they thought it would make them sick. That's the contrast the textbooks don't want you to picture. It was Africa's mind and Africa's discipline that taught Europe how to live clean, think clearly, and govern intelligently. The scholars of the Moors didn't hoard knowledge, they shared it. In the House of Wisdom in Toledo, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish thinkers sat together translating ancient works from Greek, Persian, and Egyptian sources into Arabic and then Latin. That pipeline of learning was what reintroduced Aristotle and Plato to the West. Without that translation movement, the foundations of European philosophy, science, and law wouldn't exist. And what powered it all was an African concept: knowledge as a communal inheritance, not a private possession. The Moors saw intellect as something sacred, something that connected humanity to creation itself. That idea came from much older African traditions, stretching back to the Nile Valley, where temple schools taught that wisdom was the essence of divine order. So when the Moors built universities like Al-Qarawiyyan and Al-Andalus's madrasas, they were continuing a lineage thousands of years old. The first European students who studied under African professors in Spain went home astonished by what they'd seen. They learned algebra, geometry, medicine, and architecture. They learned that beauty and function could coexist. They returned to their homelands, carrying Moorish books, Moorish instruments, and Moorish habits, bathing regularly, eating with utensils, wearing tailored garments. That's how culture spreads, not through conquest, but through example. But as Europe grew richer and more powerful, its memory began to rot. Gratitude turned to arrogance. The same Europe that had once knelt to learn now stood tall, pretending it had discovered itself. They renamed African discoveries. Al-Jabr became algebra. Al-Kul became alcohol. Even algorithm, born from the African mathematician Al-Khwarizmi's name, was stripped of its origin. That's how theft works. You take the work, erase the face, and rewrite the story. Yet every time you use a word that begins with Allah, you're whispering Africa's name. It's there, hiding in plain sight, just like the people who made it all possible. What's even more telling is how the European Church reacted. They labeled Moorish science as heresy, claiming that studying the stars was witchcraft and that medicine was blasphemy. They burned books while the Moors built libraries. But you can't burn truth forever. The embers drifted north, igniting what Europe would later call the Renaissance. That so-called rebirth was just a delayed recognition of what Africa had already mastered. Every cathedral's arch, every philosopher's thesis, every piece of modern medicine owes a debt to the Moors who carried knowledge through centuries of darkness. The question isn't whether Europe learned from Africa, it's why they're still afraid to admit it. Maybe because admitting it would mean accepting that the very definition of civilization was written in black hands long before it was translated into Latin. The truth is simple. The Moors didn't just save Europe from the Dark Ages, they gave it light so bright that even today, the world still walks in its glow. As the centuries rolled on, Moorish influence seeped into every layer of European life, reshaping not just infrastructure, but imagination itself. The Moors showed Europe how to dream again, and how to design those dreams into stone, sound, and science. Architecture is where their fingerprints shine most clearly. Look at the cathedrals that rose across Europe after the Moors arrived, arches that curve like the domes of Cordoba, courtyards echoing the geometry of North African palaces, water channels carved into gardens for reflection and calm. These weren't coincidences, they were continuations of African design philosophy. The Gothic arch, that became Europe's architectural pride, was directly inspired by the horseshoe arch of the Moors. The very word architect in Europe regained its sacred meaning because African builders treated geometry like a language of God. They saw the divine in precision, in balance, in light falling through a window at just the right angle. That's what the Moors brought, not just knowledge, but order, the kind of structure that binds beauty to logic. Inside the Alhambra, every tile, every line of calligraphy, every curve of marble whispers that lesson, symmetry is sacred. When European builders walked those halls, they took notes. They returned home and built cathedrals using mathematics they didn't invent, creating monuments to faith with African blueprints. Even the concept of urban planning, the organization of roads, sanitation, and water, came directly from Moorish cities. Granada and Cordoba were mapped with grids, fountains, drainage, and public spaces designed for both function and beauty. Paris and Florence copied the idea centuries later, and in that exchange, a civilization reborn from Africa began to forget its source. But even Europe's art and music bore the mark of Africa. The lute, ancestor of the modern guitar, was a Moorish creation. Its rhythms and tonal scales carried echoes of West African music, full of syncopation and call-and-response patterns that later evolved into European folk traditions, and much later, jazz. Moorish poetry, sensual, intellectual, layered with metaphor, taught Europe to merge reason with emotion. Their poets spoke of love and logic, stars and souls, merging science with beauty long before Shakespeare ever picked up a quill. And then there was medicine. Al-Zahrawi, of Cordoba, an African physician, wrote a 30-volume encyclopedia on surgery that Europe would rely on for half a millennium. He invented over 200 surgical instruments, many still used in modern form today. He described childbirth procedures, dentistry, and the treatment of fractures in ways that stunned later doctors. European medical schools translated his works into Latin, but erased his name, pretending his wisdom had no color. But you can't hide genius forever. Every hospital in Europe that followed his model is, knowingly or not, honoring a man from Moorish Spain, a man with African ancestry, who saw healing as both art and science. The Moors even understood mental health at a time when Europe saw the mad as possessed by demons. They built hospitals with gardens, music, and running water because they believed peace of mind was essential to healing. That level of compassion was centuries ahead of its time. And what did Europe do with these gifts? It absorbed them, renamed them, and pretended they were miracles born from within. They called their awakening the Age of Discovery, but the only thing they discovered was what Africa had already known. The irony is painful. the same continent Europe would later enslave, had once been its teacher, its savior, its light in the dark. The Moors didn't just rescue Europe from ignorance, they taught it how to build, think, and live. And when Europe finally stood again, it closed the door on its teachers, locking away the memory of the black hands that raised its foundations. But memory has a way of leaking through cracks, and if you listen closely, the walls of Granada still hum with the songs of those African architects who once ruled by wisdom, not by sword. By the time Europe stumbled into what it proudly calls the Renaissance, the African fingerprints were everywhere, in the math that guided painters' perspectives, in the domes that crowned their churches, in the libraries that filled their cities. Yet, the story was rewritten. The brilliance that had poured out of Moorish Spain was relabeled as European genius, a convenient lie that erased the source while celebrating the product. But history has a long memory, and when you start peeling back the marble, the truth gleams beneath. The Renaissance masters, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Galileo, all studied texts that came through Arabic translation, written originally by African and Arab scholars during the Moorish Golden Age. The Moors preserved Aristotle when Europe burned him. They copied Ptolemy, translated Euclid, and built observatories that mapped the heavens with mathematical precision. While Europe's universities were preaching theology as fact, Moorish scientists were measuring the Earth's circumference within a fraction of modern accuracy. Let that sink in. Africans and Arabs, centuries before the telescope, already knew the planet was round. The universities of Fez, Cairo, and Cordoba were the real birthplaces of modern academia, predating Oxford and Cambridge. At the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, founded by an African woman, Fatima al-Fihri, students studied algebra, astronomy, and philosophy at a time when most of Europe's scholars couldn't read their own language. Those African institutions didn't just teach knowledge, they defined what knowledge was. When Christian scholars fled to Spain seeking to learn, the Moors opened their libraries and translated thousands of texts into Latin. That's where Europe's reawakening began, in African classrooms. Even the so-called father of modern medicine, Paracelsus, based much of his work on Moorish and Egyptian medical writings. The compass, the astrolabe, the concept of zero, all came through the hands of African and Islamic scholars. And yet, the lie persisted that Europe invented civilization anew after centuries of ignorance. But here's what the art doesn't tell you. In Florence, when artists painted angels with halos, those circles of light were inspired by Islamic geometric symbolism, where divine symmetry represented perfection. Even the domes of the Vatican bear resemblance to the mosques of Istanbul and the palaces of North Africa. The architecture of worship, the science of balance, all borrowed from the Moors, who once lit the lamps of knowledge across Andalusia. And while the Europeans learned, the African Moors built societies grounded in tolerance. Jews, Christians, and Muslims coexisted under their rule in ways unimaginable in medieval Europe. They debated philosophy, treated one another sick, shared music in courtyards lined with fountains and mosaics. They understood something Europe hadn't yet grasped, that civilization thrives on inclusion, and for centuries, it did. Cordoba had over 70 libraries, 300 public baths, and well-paved streets, while London and Paris were still drowning in mud. European visitors wrote of Moorish cities glowing with light at night, literal light, from oil lamps that illuminated streets, where scholars debated long after sunset. Europe's so-called Dark Ages were only dark because Africa's light hadn't reached them yet. The irony is bitter. The very people who later colonized Africa learned refinement, hygiene, and science from Africans. Yet as the centuries turned, the narrative shifted. The fall of Moorish Spain marked not just a political conquest, but a deliberate erasure of memory. Christian rulers destroyed libraries, burned books, and scrubbed African names from the record. The brilliance of the Moors was rewritten as an invasion, not an enlightenment. but artifacts don't lie. The tiles of the Alhambra, the irrigation systems of Seville, the universities of Morocco, they all speak the same language. Progress came from the south, not the north. And now, with every excavation, every manuscript unearthed, that truth rises again, undeniable and unbowed. Africa was Europe's teacher, and the Moors were its professors. And yet, for all their brilliance, the fall of the Moors was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow, calculated unraveling, orchestrated by fear and greed. As Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain grew stronger, they began to view Moorish success as both envy and threat. How could a people darker in skin, foreign in tongue, and African in heritage be more advanced, more literate, more civilized? The answer wounded European pride, so they turned to war cloaked in religion, the Reconquista. For centuries, Christian crusaders chipped away at Moorish territories, not because they sought God's glory, but because they sought the Moors' wealth, science, and control of trade. When Granada fell in 1492, it wasn't just a city lost, it was a torch of knowledge being snuffed out. And what followed was erasure, on a scale few recognize today. Moorish scholars were forced to convert or die, libraries were torched, manuscripts burned, and entire neighborhoods were purged. The Alhambra decree ordered the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain, ending what had been one of the most tolerant societies in medieval history. Yet even as Europe pushed the Moors out, it could not erase what they had already given. The systems of irrigation that fed Spanish crops, the architecture that defined its skylines, the instruments of navigation that made global exploration possible, all of it was African in origin. Even Columbus's voyage, that so-called dawn of a new world, sailed under the shadow of Moorish science. The maps he used were drawn using knowledge from African astronomers and cartographers. Think about that. The so-called Age of Discovery was built on the discoveries of those Europe had just expelled. The irony is almost poetic, but the cruelty didn't stop at borders. It followed the people. Moors who stayed were forced into silence, stripped of names and identity, their descendants hidden in plain sight across Iberia and North Africa. And as Spain and Portugal turned to colonization, they carried Moorish knowledge in one hand and chains in the other. The navigational mathematics of Moorish scholars guided the very ships that would later enslave Africans, an unbearable twist in the story of history's cycle of power. But even through centuries of distortion, echoes of Moorish influence refused to vanish. Look at modern Spain and Italy, their architecture, their cuisine, their language. Everywhere you find traces of Africa. Words like algebra, alcohol, alchemy, arsenal, cotton, sugar, safari, all stem from Arabic and African tongues that once ruled Europe's classrooms. The Moors didn't just shape Europe's science, they shaped its very speech. But here's the part they'll never admit. When the Renaissance bloomed, the light that illuminated Michelangelo's Florence or Shakespeare's London was still glowing from embers the Moors had lit. Even the libraries of the Vatican hold texts, first translated by Moorish hands, their authors long forgotten or renamed to fit European comfort. And the further you dig, the clearer it becomes. The Renaissance wasn't a rebirth of Europe, it was a rebranding of Africa's legacy. The problem wasn't ignorance, it was theft. They didn't just learn from the Moors, they took credit for them. But time has a way of unearthing the buried. Across Morocco, Algeria, Mali, and Egypt, scholars are reclaiming manuscripts that Europe once stole. Thousands of Moorish texts on medicine, mathematics, and philosophy are being restored and digitized, proving what oral tradition has said all along. The Moors didn't save Europe by accident. They saved it because that's what Africa has always done, bring civilization where chaos reigns. When you walk through Granada today, under arches carved with geometric perfection, remember, this wasn't Europe's triumph, it was Africa's gift. The Moors didn't just build cities, they built Europe's future, even as Europe plotted their destruction. The tragedy is that while they gave the world knowledge, the world gave them silence. And now, Centuries later, that silence is breaking. Now imagine what Europe actually looked like before the Moors arrived. Not the marble fantasy you see in movies, but a cold and crumbling continent cut off from learning. After the fall of Rome, Europe fell into a genuine darkness. Libraries were destroyed, cities depopulated, trade routes collapsed, disease ran wild because people didn't understand sanitation. Even kings and nobles rarely bathed. Medical knowledge was superstition. Illnesses were curses. Surgery was outlawed by the church. And education was a privilege of monks, copying half-forgotten texts in damp stone rooms. Then, from across the Mediterranean, Africa brought fire. Moorish fleets landed in Iberia with scholars, builders, and healers, not just soldiers. They didn't come to plunder. They came to rebuild. Under Moorish rule, Spain became a center of light, while the rest of Europe fumbled in shadow. Cordoba alone had paved streets, illuminated lamps, running water, and over 70 libraries, when Paris had none. In Moorish cities, literacy was expected. Women studied mathematics and philosophy, and music from Africa and the Middle East fused into new forms that would later inspire European classics. Europeans traveled south to learn. Christian scholars, desperate to reclaim lost knowledge, came to Moorish universities, disguised as pilgrims or traders. They sat at the feet of black mathematicians and Arab philosophers, studying astronomy, geometry, and medicine, written centuries before Galileo or Copernicus. The decimal system that Europe uses today, taught by Africans. The surgical tools found in Moorish medical texts, still recognizable in hospitals now. Hygiene, architecture, irrigation, agriculture, fashion, every layer of Europe's civilization sprouted from seeds planted by the Moors. Yet Europe told the story backward. They said Africa invaded. In truth, Africa enlightened. The castles and cathedrals, later celebrated as European genius, were modeled on Moorish architecture. Horseshoe arches, domes, courtyards, mosaics, the royal coats of arms, and the language of science itself carried Arabic and African fingerprints. And even in daily life, Africans changed the way Europe ate, dressed, and lived. They introduced sugar refining, citrus cultivation, silk weaving, and complex trade systems, stretching to Mali, Sudan, and the Swahili coast. Through those connections, Europe tasted spices from India, gold from West Africa, and technologies from as far as China, all through Moorish intermediaries. The continent that once starved became nourished by the same people it would later enslave. That's the contradiction history refuses to face. The same textbooks that show brilliant Renaissance men ignore that every art of their brilliance was imported through Africa. The universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna owe their existence to the Moorish model of education, the madrasa. Even the concept of a degree came from those African Arab traditions. Think about it. Europe's universities began where Africa's temples of wisdom had already stood for centuries. Yet in popular imagination, the Moors are reduced to footnotes or invaders. What they really were the teachers of the world's next empire. They bridged the gap between ancient Egypt's wisdom and modern Europe's awakening, carrying the blueprint of civilization across time. And when people say Europe pulled itself out of the Dark Ages, they're only telling half the truth. Africa handed them the latter. Europe didn't just absorb Moorish knowledge, it imitated it, translated it, and then claimed it as its own. When the Christian kingdoms of Spain began their Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula, they weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting to control knowledge. The libraries of Cordoba, Seville, and Toledo held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy. And when these cities fell, those libraries became Europe's gold mines. Instead of destroying all the texts, Christian translators copied them feverishly, often replacing the names of African and Arab scholars with Latin pseudonyms. Al-Jahiz became Jasius. Ibn Sina became Avicenna. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gave us the word algorithm, became algorithmus. Through this intellectual theft, Africa's brilliance was whitewashed, one translation at a time. While monks in cold monasteries took credit, they were literally rewriting pages penned by Moors centuries earlier. And here's the irony: the Renaissance, that golden rebirth Europe celebrates, began not in Florence, but in Toledo, a city that had once been the heart of Moorish learning. It was there, in the translation schools of Spain, that Aristotle, Galen, and Plato returned to Europe, not from Greece, but through Africa's hands. The Renaissance was not born in isolation. It was reborn from African memory. The same continent, Europe later called uncivilized, had once healed its wounds and taught it how to think again. The irony deepens. While Europe was reawakening under stolen light, Africa was being plunged into darkness, its knowledge dismissed, its teachers erased, its empire divided by colonial greed. But in the 8th to 15th centuries, the Moors built the most advanced society in the Western world. Their architecture shaped Spain's skyline. Their irrigation systems turned deserts into gardens. Their hospitals operated with precision centuries ahead of Europe's modern medicine. In Cordoba, streets were lit by oil lamps, while London and Paris stumbled in the dark. In Moorish Spain, paper mills turned knowledge into power, while the rest of Europe still wrote on animal skins. They introduced universities open to all classes, libraries that housed books in multiple languages, and cities where Christians, Jews, and Muslims studied side by side, long before Europe learned the word tolerance. The Moors didn't just save Europe, they gave it its future. Yet ask the average person today who sparked the Renaissance, and they'll say Da Vinci. Ask them who preserved Greek philosophy, they'll say the Church. Ask them who invented modern algebra, medicine, or irrigation, and their silence will tell you everything. The truth is uncomfortable, because it rewrites who the teacher and the student really were. Europe's so-called awakening was Africa's echo. The question now is, why did they erase the source? Why did Europe rewrite its rebirth, as if Africa was never in the room? Because acknowledging the Moors as the saviors of Europe would mean admitting that Africa was the foundation of modern civilization. It would shatter the myth of European superiority that powered colonization, slavery, and centuries of propaganda. Think about it. If Europe had told the truth, that Africans once ruled its universities, designed its architecture, healed its sick, and lit its cities, how could it justify enslaving the very descendants of those same people? It couldn't, so the story had to be rewritten. History was edited like a movie, every African frame cut out until Europe looked self-made. In textbooks, the Moors were reduced to invaders, their skin tones lightened in paintings, their cities renamed, their scholars renamed, their science baptized as European discovery. When they spoke of the Renaissance, they praised Da Vinci's inventions, but never mentioned that the same devices, gears, fountains, water clocks, had been mastered in Moorish Spain centuries earlier. The entire foundation of Western progress was built on Moorish blueprints, yet the architects were erased. Even hygiene, something as simple as bathing, became a symbol of stolen culture. While Africans and Arabs had public baths and daily rituals of cleanliness, Europeans mocked them until they adopted the habit themselves and called it refinement. The irony is thick. The people who once learned to bathe from Africans would later call Africans unclean. But the erasure went deeper than insults. It was systemic. When the Moors were finally expelled from Spain in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west, their libraries were burned, their mosques converted, and their descendants forced to convert or flee. Generations of African bloodlines in Spain and Portugal were reclassified as mulatto or Moorish remnants, stripped of identity, and folded into whiteness over time. Europe's golden age was born on African genius, then baptized in white ink. Yet traces of the Moors remain everywhere, in the architecture of southern Spain, in the language itself. Every Spanish word beginning with algebra, alcohol, alcázar, almohada, comes directly from Arabic and North African roots. The Moors' presence is in the tiles of Seville, the fountains of Granada, the domes of Lisbon. Their fingerprints are so obvious that history had to blind itself not to see them. Still, their influence couldn't be completely erased. The Renaissance thinkers who shaped modern Europe, Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, all studied works preserved by the Moors: the compass, the astrolabe, the university, the hospital, the observatory, all gifts of Africa's science and curiosity. Europe inherited Africa's brilliance, but never gave credit. And that's the greatest trick history ever pulled: to make the teacher forget himself, and the student believe he was born knowing. But the truth doesn't die, it waits. The stones of Alhambra still whisper in geometric patterns. The manuscripts in dusty vaults still tell the real story. The Moors were not Europe's shadows, they were its sun, and no matter how long the lie has lasted, the light of that truth still burns beneath the whitewash. Picture this: the year is 1492, the last Moorish stronghold, Granada, falls to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella. The African banners that once waved proudly over Al-Andalus are torn down, replaced by crosses and crowns. The Moors, who had ruled Spain for nearly 800 years, are suddenly outlaws in the very land they built. Their scholars are exiled, their libraries are set ablaze, their architecture stripped of identity. The world calls this the victory of Christianity, but what really fell that day was the last light of the ancient world, an African light that had kept Europe alive through its darkest centuries. And in that same year when Columbus set sail, Europe carried the stolen fruits of Moorish knowledge into a new age of conquest. The navigational tools that guided his voyage were designed by Africans. The maps he studied came from Moorish geographers who charted the world before he ever left port. Even the stars that guided his ships were understood through Moorish astronomy. Europe didn't just discover the world, it used African science to do it. Yet when the age of discovery turned into the age of colonization, the student betrayed the teacher. The same knowledge the Moors had shared to enlighten became the weapon used to enslave. Europe took Moorish innovation and turned it into empire. Ships built on African math, compasses guided by African astronomy, medicine shaped by African anatomy, architecture inspired by African geometry, all rebranded as Western progress. The cycle of theft became the foundation of the modern world. And still, centuries later, the textbooks stay silent. You'll hear about the Renaissance, but not about the African minds that sparked it. You'll hear about the scientific revolution, but not about the black mathematicians who gave Europe its numbers. You'll hear about Da Vinci's flying machines, but not Abbas ibn Firnas, the Moor who actually built one centuries before him. Even the word chemistry traces back to alchemia, an African and Arabic science. Every corner of European brilliance carries an African ghost, unseen, uncredited, but undeniable. The truth isn't lost, it's just buried beneath ego and empire. But it's rising again. Scholars are rediscovering Moorish manuscripts hidden in European vaults, learning that the very heart of Western thought beats to an African rhythm. So when people say Europe came out of the Dark Ages, remember who lit the candle. It wasn't Rome, it wasn't Paris, it wasn't London, it was Cordoba, it was Fez, it was Timbuktu. Africa didn't follow the world, Africa led it. And now that we see that clearly, we can start reclaiming not just what was stolen, but who we've always been: the builders, the scientists, the healers, the light bringers. The story of the Moors is not just a tale of conquest and erasure. It is a testament to African brilliance, resilience, and legacy. These were not invaders who borrowed a culture. They were the bearers of civilization, the custodians of knowledge, and the architects of Europe's rebirth. From mathematics to medicine, from architecture to philosophy, every triumph credited to Europe during the so-called Renaissance and Scientific Revolution can be traced back to African ingenuity. Yet for centuries, the narrative was twisted, rewritten to make the world believe that this genius was foreign, distant, or somehow secondary. The Moors built aqueducts and irrigation systems that transformed arid lands into thriving cities. They constructed libraries that housed thousands of manuscripts, and they created public hospitals and universities centuries ahead of Europe's own. Every street, every dome, every fountain of Andalusia whispered lessons of logic, beauty, and humanism. Lessons Europe would eventually adopt while erasing the African teachers from the story. And as Europe expanded its empires, enslaving Africans and rewriting history, the echoes of Moorish wisdom traveled with colonists, subtly shaping trade, navigation, governance, and even art across continents. Today, when we walk the streets of Seville, Granada, or Toledo, or when we study algebra, observe the stars, or marvel at Gothic cathedrals, we are interacting with a legacy that was once African, once Moorish, once vibrant and unapologetic. The point is not merely to acknowledge the theft, but to recognize the source, to see that Africa did not sit idle while Europe stumbled through darkness. Africa lit the path. The Moors taught the world how to read, how to calculate, how to heal, and how to dream. And for centuries, the world tried to forget. But history, no matter how much it is buried or whitewashed, has a way of revealing the truth. It is time to reclaim it, not as a footnote or a correction, but as the central story it has always been. Africa led, Europe followed. The Moors saved a continent, and the more we uncover, the clearer it becomes. Civilization owes its foundations to black hands, black minds, and black vision. So when you hear people speak of the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, or the birth of modern Europe, remember who the real teachers were. Remember the Moors. Remember Africa. And know that the light they brought cannot be extinguished, because it is part of the blood, the mind, and the story of humanity itself. Ask yourself, if the world was shaped by African genius and then tried to erase it, what else is waiting to be uncovered?